Hi folks, Lou here, and I'm going to talk briefly about surprise and how important surprise is. I'm not going to talk specifically about individual games, but to give an illustration of how much difference this makes, especially tactically. Now, the first thing to say is that it has been shown about World War II tank battles, for example, that whoever shoots first tends to win the battle. Now, tank battles in World War II were less common than you think. Mostly the tanks fought other things. And in fact, American doctrine was that tank destroyers should fight the enemy tanks, but that didn't work out. Nonetheless, tank battles were not typically what tanks did, but when they did, whoever shot first would usually win the battle. You can see that from a point of view of ambushes and defenses being set up and ready to fight. And that's where surprise comes in, because surprise enables one side to shoot first. So surprise is very important. Now, what set me on this road was a video on YouTube about the Battle of Maritsa, which I had never heard of, between the Ottomans and the Serbs. This one was by History Marche, M-A-R-C-H-E, but there are quite a few different channels on YouTube that do a good job of describing lots of battles. Sometimes they go too far and they talk about more than we really know, but in general, they're quite good. Well, in this case, according to History Marche, 1,000 Ottomans, mounted Ottomans, slaughtered large numbers of Serbs amongst maybe 20,000 because they got the drop on them at dawn. Now, Wikipedia gives much larger numbers, but still the big disparity. And this is an example in battle of the psychological over the physical. If the Serbs had ever figured out that there were only 1,000 Ottomans, then they would have won the battle. But what happens in battles is the troops don't know that. How can they know that? Even the leaders sometimes don't know that. And so really odd things happen. And we can think of other examples of this. At the Battle of Midway, the Americans were outnumbered, but they knew the outlines of the Japanese plan from signal intercepts and decoding. And even though the Japanese acted like the Americans were out there, they weren't convinced of it, I guess I'd say. Whereas the Americans knew the Japanese were out there before the Japanese started to attack Midway. And the Americans got in the first attacks and managed to sink 3 of the Japanese carriers. Now, where surprise has affected me as a game player is Dungeons and Dragons, because in the original Dungeons and Dragons and Advanced D&D, you would roll a die, a 6-sided die, and on a 1 or a 2, the enemy was surprised. Now, there were extenuating circumstances. I mean, sometimes you can't be surprised, but that was the general rule. And I thought it was a terrible rule because that gave somebody big advantages in the first part of the fight, and it was just too hard on the players, if not on the non-players, on the monsters. So I altered the rule to have each player roll surprise, and each character, I should say. And so it was unlikely that most of the characters would be surprised, even if some were. And that's probably a little more realistic as well. Who knows? But surprise at high levels in an RPG like Dungeons and Dragons leads to sudden death for the side that is surprised. So at some point you have to abandon realism perhaps and go with, well, these guys are really alert and so on, and they don't get surprised, or if they do get surprised, it doesn't have much effect on what happens to them, instead of having drastic effects, which was the original in D&D. So, to go back to the original point, surprise is very important tactically, and even strategically. It's much harder to arrange strategically, but I can give you one example. When the Allies, Western Allies, invaded Europe, they had convinced the Germans that they were coming at Calais. And so even after they landed in Cherbourg or in Normandy, the Germans acted as though they were going to come at Calais and didn't react quickly enough. And that gave the Allies a big advantage. Thanks for listening.